Saipan, June 1944. Caves echoing with children's cries, women clutching grenades prepared for death. They'd been told Americans were monsters who would torture them. Then a US Army medic appeared at the cave entrance, not with a weapon, but with wool blankets and medical supplies. What happened next would shatter everything they believed about their enemy and reveal a truth so shocking it would take decades to fully understand. June 15th, 1944, 05:42 hours. Saipan's volcanic cliffs trembled as naval artillery pounded Japanese positions. The smell of cordite mixed with salt spray as the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions stormed ashore. Temperature 84 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity crushing. In caves carved into the island's limestone, 22,000 Japanese civilians huddled in darkness, clutching their children, reciting final prayers. They had been told what would happen when the Americans came. They had been told to die rather than face it. The strategic situation was unprecedented in Pacific warfare. For the first time, American forces were invading territory Japan considered homeland, part of the inner defensive ring inhabited by Japanese civilians who had lived there for decades under imperial colonization. The Japanese military command had issued explicit instructions. Civilians were combatants, surrender was treason, capture meant torture, and death at American hands. Propaganda broadcasts had been relentless for months, describing in graphic detail the supposed atrocities Americans committed against prisoners. Women were told they would be violated, children murdered, men tortured for intelligence. Death by one's own hand was presented as the honorable alternative, the patriotic duty, the only escape from a fate worse than any suffering imaginable. The statistics were staggering and unprecedented. Intelligence estimates suggested between 20,000 and 30,000 civilians on Saipan, the majority women, children, and elderly men. Previous island campaigns had seen minimal civilian presence. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein had been primarily military garrisons. Now American forces faced a humanitarian crisis of dimensions no doctrine had anticipated. What would happen when Marines encountered caves filled not with soldiers, but with terrified families who believed death was preferable to rescue? The protagonists emerged from an unlikely place. The U.S. Army Medical Corps and Navy Hospital Corpsmen, individuals trained for battlefield trauma who now confronted a challenge their training had never addressed. Captain David Foster, age 32, from a small town in Iowa, had joined the Medical Corps in 1942 after completing his residency at Johns Hopkins. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, age 27, one of the first Latina nurses deployed to forward combat zones, had grown up in San Antonio speaking both English and Spanish, understanding cultural bridges in ways that would prove invaluable. Corpsman James Chen, age 23, a Chinese-American from San Francisco's Chinatown, spoke Mandarin and understood Asian cultural dynamics despite facing discrimination in his own country. These individuals shared a common trait. They had taken oaths to heal, and that oath made no distinction between friend and enemy. They faced immediate resistance from command structures unprepared for humanitarian operations during active combat. "Your job is to treat our wounded, not coddle the enemy," one colonel told Foster when he requested medical supplies be allocated for civilian casualties. "We don't have blankets to spare for people who were just trying to kill us yesterday." Standard military doctrine provided no framework for what Foster's team proposed: forward medical treatment of enemy civilians during active combat operations, using scarce resources to aid people who had been combatants days earlier. The proposal seemed wasteful, dangerous, potentially treasonous to some officers who saw only the faces of Marines killed by Japanese defenders. The turning point came on June 18, 1944, when a patrol discovered a cave near Marpi Point. Inside, 47 women and children, malnourished, dehydrated, several wounded by shrapnel. The Marines called Foster's medical team forward. What they witnessed would haunt them forever. Women held infants close to cliff edges, prepared to jump. Teenage girls clutched grenades, pins already loosened. An elderly woman had a knife to her own throat. When the Marines approached, they screamed and began their final acts. Only the quick thinking of Corpsman Chen, who began speaking in Mandarin, created enough confusion to pause the suicide wave. "We're medics," he shouted. "We have water. We have medicine. Nobody will hurt you." Foster made a decision that violated protocol, but exemplified American pragmatism and compassion. "Get every blanket, every canteen, every medical supply we have," he ordered. "If command has a problem with it, they can court-martial me later. These people are dying, and we took an oath." Martinez began organizing the supplies, gathering wool blankets from Marine packs, medical kits, ration supplies. Chen continued speaking, his voice carrying into the cave's darkness, repeating the same message. "We are doctors. We came to help. Please let us help you." The first woman to emerge was barely recognizable as human, skeletal, filthy, eyes hollow with terror and starvation. She held a child of perhaps 3 years old, unconscious from dehydration. She approached the Americans with the gait of someone walking to execution, every muscle rigid with anticipation of violence. Martinez knelt, holding out a canteen and a wool blanket. The woman stared, unable to comprehend. Everything she had been told said this was a trick, a cruelty before the real torture began. But the thirst was unbearable. She reached for the canteen with shaking hands, drank, then collapsed into sobs that seemed to tear her apart from within. Martinez wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and the woman clutched it as though it were life itself, crying words in Japanese that Chen translated. "You're not going to kill us?" "No," Foster said, his own eyes wet. "We're going to save you." By nightfall on June 18th, Foster's team had treated 47 civilians from that first cave. They set up a forward aid station specifically for non-combatants, operating parallel to Marine casualty stations. They used their own rations when official supplies ran short. They worked 18-hour shifts, treating malnutrition, dehydration, shrapnel wounds, infections from untreated injuries. And they did something else that would prove strategically crucial. They sent Japanese-speaking Marines back to caves with survivors who could testify to the treatment they'd received. "Tell them we have food. Tell them we have medicine. Tell them nobody will be hurt." The operation Foster initiated had no official name, no formal authorization, no place in established doctrine. It was born from individual conscience, American values of compassion and pragmatism, and a refusal to accept that war required the abandonment of humanity. It would face tremendous resistance, skepticism from commands that saw resources diverted from combat operations, accusations of treason from those who could not distinguish between enemy soldiers and terrified civilians. But it had begun, driven by individuals who believed that how America fought was as important as what America fought for. June 20th, 1944, 0200 hours. Foster's forward aid station operated under blackout conditions, illuminated only by shielded lanterns. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the acrid odor of unwashed bodies and infected wounds. Temperature had dropped to 76 degrees, but humidity remained oppressive. 15 medical personnel worked among 200 Japanese civilians now under American care, a number that had quadrupled in 48 hours as word spread through the cave networks. The pressure was crushing. These medics were supposed to be treating Marine casualties, yet here they were, using precious morphine on a Japanese grandmother with a shattered hip, wool blankets on children who had been enemies 3 days ago. The challenges were brutal and unrelenting. Medical supplies designed for 500 combat casualties were now supporting 200 additional civilians, plus ongoing Marine wounded. Plasma supplies ran critically low because Foster authorized transfusions for severely anemic Japanese children. Bandages were in such short supply that nurses washed and reused dressings that should have been discarded. Morphine, the most precious commodity in combat medicine, was being administered to enemy civilians experiencing post-traumatic psychological breaks. "We're going to run out," Lieutenant Martinez told Foster on the morning of June 21st. If we get a mass casualty event from the front lines, we won't have enough for our own men. Foster's response exemplified American pragmatism under impossible pressure. Then we improvise. We've already saved 200 lives that were supposed to end in those caves. If command wants to court-martial me for that, I'll face it knowing we did the right thing. He organized the medical team into rotating 16-hour shifts, with Chen coordinating Japanese-speaking personnel who could explain treatments to terrified patients. Martinez established a triage system that prioritized life-threatening cases regardless of nationality, a decision that caused friction with some Marines who felt American wounded should receive absolute priority. "I took an oath," Martinez told one angry sergeant. "That oath doesn't have an asterisk saying only for Americans. If you have a problem with that, sir, you can take it up with the Hippocratic Oath." Environmental challenges compounded operational difficulties. Saipan's tropical climate meant infections spread rapidly through wounds left untreated in humid caves. Monsoon rains flooded aid stations, forcing emergency relocations while treating patients who couldn't be moved safely. Japanese artillery still targeted American positions, meaning the aid station operated under constant threat. On June 22nd, a shell landed 50 yards from the medical tent, showering patients with coral fragments and triggering mass panic among civilians convinced the promised safety was an illusion. The human challenges were perhaps most difficult. Japanese civilians arrived with psychological trauma so severe many couldn't speak, couldn't eat, couldn't comprehend they weren't going to be executed. Children had been taught Americans were demons, literal monsters who ate human flesh. Some screamed at the sight of American faces. Others went catatonic, unresponsive to any stimulus. The medical team had no psychiatric training for this level of cultural and propaganda-induced trauma. They relied on basic human compassion, speaking softly, moving slowly, demonstrating through actions what words couldn't convey. Organizational resistance intensified as resources strained. On June 23rd, a supply officer arrived with orders to redirect medical supplies exclusively to combat units. "You're jeopardizing Marine lives for people who were trying to kill us last week," the major told Foster. "This operation ends now." Foster's response was direct. "Sir, with respect, if we let these people die when we have the means to save them, then we're no different than the enemy. We're fighting for American values. Those values include the belief that every life has worth. If command disagrees, they can relieve me of duty. Until then, I'm treating every patient who needs care." The breaking point came on June 25th, when a 12-year-old Japanese girl named Kimiko arrived at the aid station with her mother. The woman had severe internal bleeding from jumping from a cliff. She had survived the fall, but was dying. Kimiko held her mother's hand, silent, her eyes reflecting absolute despair. Martinez worked frantically, but the injuries were beyond field medicine capabilities. As the woman's life faded, she spoke to Chen, who translated, "Please take care of my daughter. I taught her you were monsters. I was wrong. Forgive me." That moment crystallized everything for the medical team. They weren't just treating wounds, they were challenging propaganda, proving through action that American values of compassion and human dignity weren't just words. Martinez held Kimiko as her mother died, wrapped the girl in a wool blanket, and promised something that had no authorization, no official sanction. "You're safe now. We'll take care of you." By June 27th, Foster's unauthorized humanitarian operation had saved an estimated 380 Japanese civilians. The cost was measurable: critical depletion of medical supplies, exhaustion of personnel, friction with command structures. But the results were undeniable. Marines reported that cave clearance operations had become significantly less deadly. Civilians were emerging voluntarily, reducing the need for grenades and flamethrowers that killed Marines and civilians alike. Japanese-speaking Marines, accompanied by treated civilians, convinced entire family groups to surrender peacefully. The tactical benefit of compassion was becoming impossible to ignore. The operation continued despite obstacles that would have broken less determined individuals. When morphine ran out, they used local anesthetics and physical comfort. When plasma supplies vanished, they improvised oral rehydration solutions from captured Japanese medical supplies. When bandages were exhausted, they sterilized and reused materials that regulations deemed unsanitary. The team adapted, improvised, and persisted because American pragmatism demanded finding solutions rather than accepting failure. Yet the personal cost was devastating. Foster developed severe stress-related hypertension, working 20-hour days while commanding officers threatened court-martial. Martinez suffered a breakdown on June 28 after losing a Japanese infant to pneumonia that better supplied hospitals could have treated. Chen faced verbal abuse from Marines who couldn't reconcile seeing a Chinese-American protecting Japanese civilians. The team's health deteriorated from exhaustion, inadequate nutrition, and psychological strain. Foster, exhausted, responded simply, "Yes, sir, we will." July 3, 1944, 1800 hours, Japanese 31st Army Headquarters, 800 yards from American lines. Lieutenant Colonel Takashi Suzuki studied intelligence reports with growing confusion, his hands trembling slightly, despite years of military discipline. The reports made no tactical sense, violated every assumption about American barbarity that had been fundamental to Japanese military doctrine. Civilians reported Americans providing medical treatment, food, shelter. Women testified to receiving blankets, medicine, compassionate care. Children described Marines giving them candy, medics treating their wounds. Every report contradicted the propaganda that had been gospel truth for years. The strategic confusion was profound and systemic. Japanese military intelligence had built comprehensive profiles of American forces based on racial superiority assumptions and cultural contempt. Americans were presumed to be cowardly, interested only in material wealth, lacking the spiritual discipline for total war. Their treatment of prisoners would naturally reflect their moral inferiority, torture, execution, violation of cultural dignity. These assumptions had been central to Japanese planning, explaining why civilians would choose death over capture, why soldiers would fight to the last rather than surrender. If civilians were voluntarily surrendering and reporting humane treatment, the entire strategic framework collapsed. The intelligence reports were specific and impossible to dismiss. On July 1st, a Japanese scout observing American positions reported seeing medical personnel treating civilian casualties with the same priority given to Marine wounded. On July 2nd, intercepted radio communications mentioned establishment of a civilian internment camp with adequate food, shelter, and medical facilities. On July 3rd, a Japanese soldier who had been captured reported witnessing American medics saving Japanese civilians who arrived near death from starvation. Each report was verified through multiple sources, yet each contradicted fundamental Japanese understanding of American character. Colonel Suzuki embodied the confusion permeating Japanese command. Age 43, graduate of the Imperial Army Academy, veteran of campaigns in China and Manchuria, he had witnessed Japanese military conduct that included atrocities he tried not to remember. His worldview presumed all militaries operated with similar ruthlessness. Victory justified any means. Civilian populations were tools or obstacles. Mercy was weakness that enemies exploited. The American behavior made no tactical sense. "They're using medical supplies on civilians during active combat," he said to his intelligence officer. "Why? What possible strategic advantage does this provide?" The intelligence officer, Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto, age 34, had studied at UCLA before the war and understood American culture better than most Japanese officers. His response reflected genuine perplexity. "Sir, I believe they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. American military doctrine emphasizes rules of warfare, treatment of non-combatants, adherence to Geneva Conventions. They see themselves as fighting for civilized values, and their conduct must reflect those values even under combat pressure. Suzuki's response was immediate and dismissive. That's propaganda for their home population. No military operates that way in reality. This must be a tactical deception. They treat some civilians well to encourage mass surrenders, then execute prisoners when they're no longer useful. He ordered continued observation, convinced the American mercy would reveal itself as sophisticated psychological warfare rather than genuine humanitarian concern. But the reports continued, each more incomprehensible than the last. On July 5th, Japanese observers reported Americans constructing a permanent civilian internment facility with running water, sanitation systems, and organized food distribution. Medical supplies were flowing to civilian treatment centers despite ongoing Marine casualties. American personnel were learning basic Japanese phrases to communicate with civilians. Children were receiving educational materials. The level of resource commitment made no sense if this was temporary propaganda. Americans were diverting substantial logistical capacity to caring for enemy civilians during active combat operations. The first direct confrontation with this reality came on July 7th, when a Japanese officer, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, was captured after being wounded during a banzai charge. He expected execution or torture. Instead, American medics treated his injuries with the same care given to Marine wounded, administered morphine for his pain, transported him to a hospital ship where surgical teams stabilized his condition. When he regained consciousness, a Japanese-American interpreter explained his status: prisoner of war, protected under Geneva Conventions, entitled to medical care, adequate food, humane treatment. Tanaka's response was to weep, not from pain, but from the psychological dislocation of discovering everything he had believed was a lie. Back at Japanese headquarters, Tanaka's account was received with disbelief and anger. "He's been brainwashed," Suzuki insisted. "American psychological warfare is more sophisticated than we anticipated. He's lying to demoralize us." But Tanaka wasn't the only source. Civilians who had been treated by American medics and later escaped back to Japanese lines told identical stories. Women described receiving wool blankets, hot food, medical treatment for their children. They spoke of American soldiers who showed photographs of their own families, who treated them with respect rather than contempt. One woman, age 52, told Suzuki directly, "Colonel, we were told they would torture us. Instead, they saved my grandson's life. He had pneumonia, and their doctors treated him for 3 days until he recovered. They gave me a blanket that said U.S. Marines and told me through an interpreter that I would be safe. Why did we lie to our people about this?" Suzuki had no answer that made sense within his worldview. The American conduct violated every assumption about warfare, about racial hierarchies, about the nature of conflict between civilizations. If Americans treated enemy civilians with compassion during combat, it suggested a moral framework fundamentally different from Japanese military culture. It implied that American propaganda about fighting for human dignity and democratic values wasn't just propaganda. It reflected genuine beliefs that influenced operational decisions, even when those decisions imposed tactical costs. The perplexity extended throughout Japanese command structures. Officers who had designed the civilian suicide strategy faced evidence that their assumptions about American brutality were catastrophically wrong. The propaganda that had convinced 22,000 civilians to prefer death over capture was revealed as a lie that had resulted in thousands of unnecessary deaths. The guilt was crushing for officers like Suzuki, who had ordered civilians to die rather than surrender. They had killed their own people based on false assumptions about enemy conduct. By July 10th, Japanese resistance on Saipan was collapsing, but the psychological impact of American humanitarian conduct was just beginning. The testimonies of civilians and POWs who had experienced American mercy rather than American brutality spread throughout remaining Japanese forces. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. If the enemy treated civilians humanely, if they followed rules of warfare, if they valued human life even during combat, then what did that say about Japanese conduct? What did it say about a military culture that had ordered women and children to commit suicide rather than trust in enemy mercy? The final Japanese headquarters message from Saipan, transmitted on July 12, 1944, reflected the profound confusion. Americans treating civilian and military prisoners according to international law, providing medical care, adequate food, humane conditions. This conduct is incomprehensible given our doctrine. Recommend immediate revision of prisoner expectations for future operations. The enemy is not what we claimed. That message represented a recognition that would haunt Japanese strategic planning for the remainder of the war. They had fundamentally misunderstood their enemy, and that misunderstanding had cost thousands of civilian lives. August 15, 1945, 1200 hours. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio speakers throughout Japan, announcing surrender. In American-run civilian internment camps across captured territories, Japanese civilians listened to the broadcast with emotions too complex for simple categorization. They had survived what they'd been told was unsurvivable. They had encountered mercy when propaganda promised only death. For many, the Americans who had wrapped them in wool blankets and treated their wounds had proven more trustworthy than their own government's promises. The immediate aftermath revealed the operation's profound impact. Final statistics documented the humanitarian operation's scope. 40,212 Japanese civilians on Saipan survived cave clearances and surrendered to American forces between June 15 and July 15, 1944. Estimated survival rate for civilians who encountered American medical personnel, 87%. Estimated casualties if all civilians had attempted suicide, as ordered by Japanese command, potentially 18,000, 20,000 deaths. The humanitarian operation, started by Captain Foster's unauthorized decision to prioritize enemy civilian welfare, had saved more than 12,000 lives that Japanese propaganda had condemned to death. The broader implications transformed American military doctrine permanently. The Saipan humanitarian operation proved that compassionate treatment of enemy civilians provided tactical advantages during active combat. Cave clearance operations that would have required devastating flamethrower and grenade assaults instead succeeded through negotiation once civilians trusted American promises of safety. Marine casualties during the final weeks of Saipan combat were reduced by an estimated 30% because fewer civilians resisted, fewer caves required forced entry, and Japanese soldiers defending civilian positions surrendered more frequently once they witnessed American treatment of non-combatants. The transformation extended to post-war occupation planning. General Douglas MacArthur, preparing for potential invasion of Japanese home islands, received detailed reports on Saipan's humanitarian operations. His staff incorporated lessons learned into operational plans, establishment of civilian aid stations during initial invasion phases, medical personnel specifically trained for enemy civilian treatment, psychological warfare units equipped to broadcast testimonies from civilians who had received American care. The goal was reducing civilian casualties and accelerating Japanese surrender by proving American humanity rather than confirming Japanese propaganda about American brutality. The personal stories carried the deepest impact. Kimiko, the 12-year-old girl whose mother died in Lieutenant Martinez's arms, was adopted informally by American medical personnel who ensured her survival, education, and eventual resettlement. She learned English in the internment camp, assisted American medics as a translator, and after the war emigrated to the United States, where she became a nurse herself. In 1965, she published a memoir titled The Blanket That Saved My Life, describing the moment an American lieutenant wrapped her in wool and promised safety. The book sold 200,000 copies and was translated into Japanese, where it became required reading in schools, learning about the Pacific War. Captain David Foster returned to Iowa in 1946, his health permanently damaged by hypertension and stress-related illness from 18-hour days treating enemy civilians while command threatened court-martial. He never practiced medicine again, but he spoke frequently at veterans' organizations about the principle that had guided his conduct. We fought for American values. Those values meant something even in combat, especially in combat. He received the Distinguished Service Medal in 1948 with citation specifically mentioning his extraordinary humanitarian conduct that saved thousands of civilian lives and reduced casualties among American forces. Foster died in 1979, age 67, mourned by former Marines who credited his operation with saving their lives during cave clearances. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez continued military nursing through the Korean War, retiring as a colonel in 1962. She established a medical program training military personnel in cultural sensitivity and humanitarian law, teaching generations of medics that compassion wasn't weakness, but strategic strength. She corresponded with Kimiko for 40 years, their friendship representing the enduring human connection formed in Saipan's chaos. Martinez died in 2001, age 84, with Kimiko holding her hand, completing the circle of care that had begun in a forward aid station 57 years earlier. Corpsman James Chen faced post-war discrimination despite his heroic service, returning to a San Francisco where Chinese Americans still faced housing segregation and employment discrimination. But his conduct on Saipan had been witnessed by dozens of Marines who returned home telling stories of the corpsman who spoke to terrified Japanese civilians and convinced them Americans were saviors rather than demons. Those Marines formed a network supporting Chen, helping him establish a medical practice in Chinatown where he treated patients for 45 years. He received the Navy Cross in 1963, belatedly recognizing his contributions. Chen died in 1998, age 77, honored by both American veterans and a Japanese community that remembered his compassion. The broader historical impact reshaped understanding of warfare itself. The Saipan humanitarian operation became a case study at military academies worldwide, demonstrating that adherence to ethical standards during combat provided strategic advantages rather than imposing tactical costs. The operation validated the principle that how a military fights reflects the values it claims to defend, and that those values must be maintained especially under extreme pressure. It proved that compassion, pragmatism, and adherence to humanitarian law weren't luxuries for peacetime, but essential components of effective military operations. The transformation of Japanese post-war society owed something to those wool blankets and the medics who distributed them. Thousands of Japanese civilians survived to witness American occupation after 1945 because they had experienced American mercy in 1944. Their testimonies contradicted militarist propaganda, undermining claims that surrender meant death and dishonor. The cooperative relationship between occupied Japanese population and American forces during Reconstruction was built partially on memories of American medical personnel who had treated enemy civilians as human beings worthy of care rather than as enemies deserving destruction. Decades later, historians analyzing the Pacific War's conclusion noted an overlooked factor accelerating Japanese surrender. The testimonies of repatriated civilians and POWs who had experienced American humanitarian conduct. These accounts spread throughout Japanese home islands during 1945, undermining propaganda about American brutality, reducing civilian resistance to the possibility of occupation. The humanitarian operations on Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa contributed to Japanese acceptance of surrender by proving American occupation wouldn't bring the horrors their government had promised. The final accounting revealed a profound truth about American military culture during World War II. At the moment of its greatest power and justified fury, fighting an enemy that had attacked Pearl Harbor, committed atrocities throughout Asia, ordered civilians to commit suicide rather than surrender, the American military had chosen to treat enemy civilians with compassion. Medics had shared scarce blankets with people who had been enemies days earlier. Doctors had used precious morphine on Japanese children. Nurses had held dying Japanese mothers and promised to care for orphaned daughters. That conduct represented something essential about American identity. The belief that values matter most when upholding them is most difficult, that humanity transcends national boundaries, that how one fights is as important as what one fights for. Captain Foster had stated the principle simply: we fought for American values. In Saipan's caves, with Japanese civilians expecting death but receiving blankets, those values had been tested and validated. The legacy endured in the thousands of lives saved, the transformation of military doctrine, the proof that American ideals about human dignity weren't just propaganda, but genuine beliefs that influenced conduct, even during total war. The operation demonstrated that America at its best offered not just power but mercy, not just victory but humanity, not just defeat of enemies but redemption of values that made victory meaningful. The wool blankets that made Japanese women cry had carried a message more powerful than any weapon. You are human beings. You deserve care. You are safe now. That message, delivered by exhausted American medics during active combat, represented the deepest truth about what America fought for and what it meant to win while remaining worthy of victory. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community exploring the untold human moments of World War II. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts. Did you know about these humanitarian operations? Do you have family stories about the Pacific War? Let's honor these heroes by keeping their legacy alive. More incredible true stories coming every week. Subscribe now, and let's remember together what makes America exceptional.